Deputy Coppinger to address Amendment 1.
Thanks, Ciarán. This amendment relates to the definition of consent, which many organisations dealing with victims of violence and sexual violence, obviously in particular, have campaigned for and asked the government to include. I think the definition speaks very clearly and simply for itself. This is a huge issue in society as well, because increasingly we're seeing in rape cases that the alleged perpetrator is using the defence that the person didn't object, either for a whole number of reasons, because they may not have been in a position to object, they may have been inebriated, they may have, for a whole variety of reasons. So I'm just hoping that the Minister will include this, because again it's been something that's been asked for and campaigned for by organisations, and I think this is the place that it should go in, which is the Sexual Offences Bill. So,
thank you. Okay. Are there any other members indicating to speak to the First Amendment in Section 2 before I invite the Taoiseach to reply? I beg your pardon?
Callahan's amendment.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, 88 and 89 and 90.
Yes.
Well, I have invited members if they wish to speak to it. It is a grouping.
The Taoiseach's response first.
That's grand, Deputy O'Callaghan. Please, Taoiseach.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank deputies for all of the deputies who proposed these amendments, and it is an issue that I have been considering and been concerned about, and I, obviously have heard the voices of people who believe that we should have this in the bill. And I want to say that I agree in principle that we, Deputy Coppinger and Deputy O'Callaghan and others, I want to say to you that I agree in principle with what you're suggesting, that we should provide in statute for a definition of what is consent, and clarifying what I would say is a non-exhaustive list, the circumstances where consent to a sexual act cannot be or is not obtained. It is a complex issue, and I think people recognise that. We want to make sure that what we're putting in. I mean, there are strong arguments to rely on precedent, actually, and that was some of the original advice that I had got, that the precedents were strong here and were, would if you like, suffice rather than going for a definition. And there are issues in relation to the definition, quite how it's done, that have to be, very carefully considered. And we want to make sure that there's no unintended consequences and that we'd arrive in a situation where, in fact, we weren't helping the situation, weren't helping the victim, but we're making it more complicated. Having said that, it is absolutely my intention to bring forward an amendment at report stage of this bill. And I believe those amendments will largely reflect what is contained in the amendments from deputies here this morning. That's amendment number 188 and 89. I have got further legal advice on it. I do want to say to deputies, I have gone out for external counsel's legal advice. I've gone to experts on this to get further advice, and I've also doing some further consultation with the relevant stakeholders. And once I have got to that point, I will introduce a definition of consent along the lines set out in this group of amendments, as well as setting out the list of circumstances which, if proven, would vitiate consent. These would include, but not be limited to, the use or threat of force, unlawful detention, unconsciousness, including being asleep, intoxication, mistake and deceit. So, as I say, it would be a non-exhaustive list, because I think that's important as well. It will be necessary in the definition that I bring forward to clearly set out the sexual acts in question to which the definition of consent would apply. And I would suggest at this stage that these would be the offences under the Criminal Law Rape Act of 1981 and 1990, which are rape, aggravated sexual assault and sexual assault. And it may be that the amendment should be introduced into those acts, but using this bill, rather than a standalone provision in this bill. So I would do it in this legislation, but it would be relevant to those pieces of legislation. Yeah. So just to say that I will come forward, and I would ask deputies, perhaps on the understanding that we're doing detailed work to arrive at the very best definition, and to consider all of the unintended consequences, to perhaps wait until the report stage before taking a decision in relation to how they would handle this, and I will have an amendment at that point.
Thank you. Deputy Coppinger, would you like to respond?
I don't know if any of the others want to go first.
Yes. Deputy O'Callaghan.
Well, I welcome the fact that the Taoiseach has announced that she intends to bring forward a definition of consent at a report stage. I appreciate that this issue is complex and complicated. I, like Deputy Coppinger, have tried to define consent. It is difficult. I think it's important that we acknowledge that a lot of sexual activity in Ireland is accompanied by alcohol consumption, and we have to be very careful in how we, I suppose, draft a definition of consent, that we don't end up unintentionally criminalising a lot of young people or other people in respect to that. So because it's such a complicated and difficult area, I think we should wait to see what the Minister comes up with as a proposed amendment at report stage. We can consider that at that stage, and I don't see any downside to us awaiting that. Thanks.
Thank you, Deputy O'Callaghan. Deputy Daly.
I'm fair play to the Minister. She can come together with an answer or a motion that adequately deals with all the complex issues by this day next week.
We'll do our best.
It's a big task, and I think it is an incredibly complex area, and there is a view that actually in legislation, in some ways, less is more. And a definition, for example, of defining the sexual activity as being voluntary or a free choice is probably a better way, rather than a prescriptive list then of activities, because if you have 10 activities, well then is the 11th one less important in circumstances which hadn't been envisaged. And then of course there are circumstances which, there are nuances, I suppose, as well. We can't be black and white about these things. I mean, I certainly wouldn't accept the amendments in the present form in which they're there. I think I would like to see something about the voluntary nature. I'm not sure a list works. I mean, the list is, I don't know if it was a mistake, but maybe it wasn't. We certainly enjoyed section H, where somebody consented to sexual activity because they were mistaken as to its quality, and we really thought that was there was a lot of people out there who probably have cause to think now, if we agreed that they were involved in non-consensual behaviour. So I think we can be really a little bit unintended in our efforts. So I mean, I'm very happy to wait for the Minister's amendment, but I would say if it's a prescriptive list, I'd be kind of a bit reticent on that.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to reiterate what was said. I know in the Dáil sitting there was broad consensus across the House to provide some sort of definition, but I think, as has been mentioned by my colleagues, we have to be very careful around how prescriptive we are and how we properly codify this. And I think we have to work with the Minister to ensure that this is done properly and carefully, and that we don't jump into a particular amendment that would have unintended consequences. So I welcome the fact that the Minister is going to bring this forward at report stage. I think it'll, that will, I suppose, reiterate the words of many deputies in the House that there is a Minister progressing. I think that's welcome.
Thank you. Chambers, Deputy Wallace.
Minister, I'm actually looking forward to going down to Garda Síochána complaining about the quality of sex I had the night before.
It was an opposition amendment. H.
Or should I go to the Ombudsman? That's a fair point, Jim, yeah.
Deputy Wallace. Deputy Coppinger.
Well, first of all, obviously the wording, people can joke about it, but actually somebody who begins a sexual act and then doesn't realise what it entails can then withdraw their consent. That's the point. I think I'm certainly willing to wait and see what the Minister produces, as long as we have a chance, to then amend it. That's the point. These definitions have been suggested by people who actually deal with rape victims. They weren't written off the top of my head. And I think while you can have something quite loose, voluntary can also be misinterpreted or, completely we all know that victims and women in particular, there's a lot of victim blaming rather than looking at the issues itself. So I wouldn't favour something as loose as that. I do think that there needs to be, unfortunately, it needs to be clearly stated. So I'll wait to see what the Minister produces.
I just have to...
Yes. No, go ahead. No, go ahead. Yeah.
Just because this is the first amendment of the Select Committee's address of this legislation, it's only to advise members of the options at a point such as this. Once a matter is raised here, either in amendment format or orally, you have the opportunity then to table an amendment, an appropriate amendment at report stage. I would have to ask the question, Deputy Coppinger, if the amendment is being pressed, but it will be your decision at that time to withdraw, which has no bearing in relation to your ability to retable for report stage. If you were to press, I would have to seek initially a voice vote, and in that situation, if the Minister was opposing, it is the responsibility of the Chair to find in favour of the Minister's position, whereupon you could call a full vote all. Isn't that the case? Oh, sorry, not in your case, but if another member chose to, because you're not a member of the committee. It's only just to explain. The
Minister said she's bringing forward an amendment,
yes.
So I'm willing to have a look at that.
Are you? It's just in dealing with the amendment number 1. I think we have to have a decision in relation to it. Or will you withdraw the amendment?
I can withdraw for now. And,
that's,
yeah.
Well, it's really just that academic decision, and I appreciate that. So, amendment number 1,
may I
please,
just make a point? Yeah, just to say this, that I think it is right to include a definition. I think most common law countries, that's the approach that's been taken at this stage. I did make the point about that we were Deputy Daly raised the point about it not being too restrictive, and the intention is to looking at having a list, if you like, but also having a section that would be kind of a non-exhaustive list where other factors could be considered. So that's the intention, that's the direction that we want to move in relation to this. And I just want to make the point, Chair, that if deputies would like to engage with the officials as we finalise this, that can happen before the next meeting. If deputies are interested in having that discussion, we're very happy to facilitate that. But I will be bringing forward an amendment at report stage.
Thank you for your open door to members in that regard. So amendment number